The sound of metal shrieking against stone echoed through the underground parking garage, and Mira Kensington didn't even flinch when the heavy steel door to the storage room exploded inward, torn from its hinges as if it were made of cardboard. She'd known he was coming. She'd felt it in her bones, in the sudden drop in temperature, in the way her heart had started racing 10 minutes ago when she'd locked herself inside this concrete tomb. What she hadn't expected was the absolute fury radiating from the towering figure that now filled the doorway, his white hair catching the dim fluorescent light like a crown of frost, his pale skin gleaming with an otherworldly luminescence that made him look carved from marble rather than flesh. Vladislav Draculesht, vampire king of the Eastern Territories, looked at her with eyes that burned crimson in the shadows, and despite everything, despite the fear that should have been clawing at her throat, despite the very real danger she'd put herself in by running from him, Mira felt strangely calm. Perhaps it was shock, perhaps it was acceptance, or perhaps somewhere deep in the part of her she didn't want to acknowledge, she'd wanted him to find her. "You ran from me," he said, his voice low and dangerous, each word precisely enunciated with the faint accent of old European nobility. "You locked yourself away like prey, hoping the predator would lose interest." Mira stood from where she'd been sitting against the far wall, brushing dust from her jeans with hands that remained remarkably steady. "I didn't run from you. I ran from the situation." The situation. He stepped over the ruined door, his movements fluid and predatory, closing the distance between them with the kind of controlled power that made her acutely aware of how small the storage room suddenly felt. The situation where assassins from the Northern Court attempted to kill you in broad daylight. The situation where you were targeted specifically because of your connection to me. That situation. The situation where I've become a liability, she corrected, meeting his burning gaze even though every instinct screamed at her to look away. The situation where people are dying because of me. Because of us. Something flickered across his perfect features, pain perhaps, or fury, or some combination of emotions too complex for her to read. He was less than 3 feet away now, towering over her 5'6" frame with his imposing height, and she could feel the cold that always surrounded him, the chill of the grave that no amount of expensive clothing could hide. Tonight he wore all black designer suit that probably cost more than her annual salary, perfectly tailored to his lean, powerful frame. He looked every inch the immortal monarch he was. "You think hiding from me keeps you safe?" he asked quietly, and somehow that soft tone was more terrifying than if he'd shouted. "You think I cannot protect you? I think your entire world is currently at war, and I think I'm just a human who got caught up in something I don't understand," Mira said, forcing strength into her voice. "I think that 3 people died yesterday trying to keep me alive, and I think that maybe if I remove myself from the equation, the Northern Court will have no reason to—" She didn't get to finish. Vladislav moved faster than her eyes could track, and suddenly she was lifted off her feet, cradled against his chest with one arm beneath her knees and the other supporting her back. The casual display of strength should have frightened her. Instead, she felt her body relax into his hold, her head fitting naturally against his shoulder. "You are not removing yourself from anything," he said, turning and carrying her toward the destroyed doorway. "You are mine to protect, mine to shield, and mine to keep safe. The Northern Court wants war. They shall have it, but they will not have you." Mira should have protested, should have demanded he put her down, should have insisted that she was capable of making her own decisions. But as Vladislav carried her out of the storage room and through the parking garage toward the sleek black car waiting with its door already open, she found herself studying his profile. Instead, the sharp angles of his face, the elegant line of his nose, the way his jaw was set with absolute determination. "When did you become so important to me?" he murmured, almost to himself, as he settled her into the back seat with surprising gentleness before sliding in beside her. The door closed, and the driver, another vampire, this one named Dorian, pulled smoothly into traffic without a word. Mira tucked her knees up, wrapping her arms around them as she watched the city lights blur past. "I've been asking myself the same question for weeks." It had started 3 months ago, though it felt like a lifetime. Mira had been working late at the museum, cataloging a new acquisition of medieval manuscripts in the conservation lab, when she discovered something that shouldn't have existed, a treaty, written in blood on parchment that had somehow remained perfectly preserved for over 500 years. The language had been archaic, a mixture of Latin and something older, but she'd managed to translate enough to understand what she was looking at. A peace accord between the vampire territories, signed by 7 kings and sealed with their blood. She'd thought it was a hoax at first, an elaborate forgery, perhaps created by some medieval scholar with too much time and imagination. But the chemical analysis had been conclusive. The parchment dated to the exact period, the ink was genuine, and the blood, impossible as it seemed, still contained viable cells when examined under microscopy. Mira had done what any rational person would do when confronted with potential evidence of vampires. She'd researched, and the deeper she'd dug, the more the impossible had begun to look terrifyingly possible. There were patterns in history families that appeared in records across centuries with the same names, mysterious deaths always occurring around certain noble houses, entire bloodlines that seemed to operate above the law in every country simultaneously. She'd been so focused on her investigation that she hadn't noticed she was being watched until the night she'd stayed late again, spreading her research across the lab table, trying to connect the dots. The temperature had dropped suddenly, dramatically, and when she'd looked up, he'd been standing in the doorway. Vladislav Draculesht. Though she hadn't known his name then, she'd only known that the most beautiful and terrifying man she'd ever seen was studying her, with eyes that reflected the light like an animal's, and that every instinct in her body was screaming at her to run. "You have something that belongs to me," he'd said in that precise, accented voice. "I would like it back." She'd been too stunned to do anything but stare as he'd crossed the room with movements too smooth to be entirely human, stopping at the table to look down at the treaty she'd spent weeks analyzing. His pale fingers had hovered over the parchment without quite touching it, and something profound and painful had crossed his features. "This is all that remains," he'd said softly. 500 years of peace, reduced to a single page of vows that no one remembers but me. "It's real," Mira had whispered. "You're real." He'd looked at her then, really looked at her, and she'd felt the weight of centuries in that gaze. "I am Vladislav Draculesht, king of the Eastern Territories, and yes, I am very real, as is the treaty you have uncovered, and as is the danger you have placed yourself in by bringing it to light." That should have been the end of it. He should have taken the treaty and disappeared into whatever shadows creatures like him inhabited, leaving her to wonder if she'd hallucinated the entire encounter. Instead, he'd asked her about her research, had listened with genuine interest as she'd nervously explained her translation process, her theories about the historical context, her questions about why such a document would have been hidden in a collection of mundane religious texts. They'd talked until dawn, until Vladislav had suddenly grown tense and announced that he needed to leave. He'd asked, not demanded, but asked if he could return the following night to continue their conversation. And fool that she was, Mira had said yes. That had been the beginning. 3 months of late-night conversations that had evolved from academic discussion into something far more personal. 3 months of learning about a world that existed in the shadows of her own, of vampire politics and ancient feuds, of immortal monarchs who still remembered what the world had been like before electricity and airplanes. 3 months of Vladislav slowly, inexorably becoming the most important person in her life, despite the impossibility of it all. And then, 2 weeks ago, everything had changed. The Northern Court, led by a ruthless vampire queen named Elizabeta Corvinus, had learned about the treaty's discovery. More importantly, they'd learned about Mira, about the human who had gained unprecedented access to the Eastern King, who sat with him in the private archives beneath his estate, who had become something far more valuable than she'd ever intended. They'd called her his weakness, his vulnerability, the soft human heart that had somehow broken through 5 centuries of careful emotional armor. And they'd decided that the easiest way to destabilize the Eastern Territories before launching an invasion was to eliminate that weakness permanently. The first assassination attempt had been clumsy, a vampire thrall with a gun, easily dispatched by Vladislav's guards. The second had been more sophisticated poison in her coffee at a cafe she frequented, which she'd only survived because Dorian had knocked the cup from her hands a second before she'd raised it to her lips. The third had been yesterday's nightmare, a coordinated assault in the museum's parking lot, 3 vampire assassins against 4 guards, and when the dust had settled, Mira had been alive. But 3 good men who'd sworn to protect her were nothing but ash. She'd seen their faces before they'd died, had heard them screaming, had felt their blood spray across her skin as Vladislav had torn through their attackers with a violence she'd never witnessed from him before, his usual controlled elegance replaced by pure, primal fury. It had been too much death, too much guilt, too much realization that this was her life now, always running, always hiding, always watching people die because she'd made the mistake of falling for someone she could never truly have. So she'd run. Had waited until Vladislav was in council with his advisors, had slipped past the guards who'd grown comfortable with her presence, and had driven to the most anonymous place she could think of, a storage facility where she'd kept boxes from her last move, in a building so mundane that she'd hoped no vampire would think to look there. She'd been wrong, obviously. She'd underestimated both Vladislav's determination and whatever supernatural senses allowed him to track her across the city. And now she was back in his world, being carried through it like precious cargo, while the Vampire King sat beside her, radiating tension and fury, and something else, something that felt dangerously like fear. "You cannot run from this," Vladislav said, breaking the silence that had stretched between them. "Do you understand? The moment you entered my life, the moment we began to care for each other, you became part of the vampire world whether you wished it or not. Hiding changes nothing. It only makes you more vulnerable." "I know," Mira admitted quietly. I needed to think. I needed space to process what happened yesterday." "You needed to grieve," he corrected, and his voice had softened slightly. "For the men who died, for the innocence you have lost, for the realization that the monster you have been keeping company with is exactly what the stories warned you about." Mira turned to look at him, studying the hard line of his jaw, the tension in his shoulders. "You're not a monster." "I killed 3 vampires yesterday with my bare hands," Vladislav said flatly. "I tore them apart while you watched, painted the ground with their blood and their ash, and felt nothing but satisfaction." "What would you call that?" "Protection," Mira said firmly. "Defense, justice for the men they'd murdered." "You see what you wish to see in me," he said, finally meeting her gaze. "You have romanticized what I am because I have been careful to show you only my civilized face. But yesterday you saw the truth, what I am capable of when threatened. And you ran." "I didn't run because of what you did," Mira said, frustration creeping into her voice. "I ran because 3 men died protecting me. I ran because this war is happening because of our relationship. I ran because I can't stand the thought of more people dying just so I can—" She cut herself off, but it was too late. "So you can what?" Vladislav asked, leaning closer. "Finish your thought." "So I can be with you," she whispered. "So I can be selfish enough to want something that's clearly destroying everything around us." The car had stopped while they'd been talking, Mira realized. They were in an underground garage, though not the one they'd left. This one was far more luxurious, with marble floors and soft lighting, and the kind of security that came with vampire wealth. Vladislav's estate, she assumed. The fortress he'd tried to keep her in for her own safety. Dorian opened the door, but Vladislav made no move to exit. Instead, he turned fully toward Mira, and the expression on his face was more raw than she'd ever seen it. "Do you know," he said softly, "how long I have walked this earth? I was born in 1423. I have lived through plagues and wars, through the rise and fall of empires, through centuries of loneliness, broken only by temporary alliances and brief pleasures. I have had lovers, yes, mortals and immortals both, but I have never allowed myself to care. Caring is weakness for creatures like us. Attachment is vulnerability. Love is a sword that enemies will always turn against you." He reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and cupped her face with one cold palm. "And then you appeared in that laboratory, surrounded by your papers and your passion and your brilliant, fearless curiosity. You looked at me, truly looked at me, and instead of screaming, instead of running, you asked me if I would help you understand what you had found. You treated me not as a monster or a myth, but as a person who might have answers you needed, and I was lost." Mira felt her breath catch. They'd danced around this for weeks, both of them acknowledging the attraction, the connection, but never quite saying it aloud, never making it real. "You think I do not know the cost?" Vladislav continued, his thumb brushing across her cheekbone with startling tenderness. "You think I have not counted every life lost because of my selfishness in keeping you close, but I cannot let you go. I have tried to convince myself that your safety matters more than my desire, that the logical thing would be to erase your memories and send you away to live a normal life far from all of this. And I cannot do it. Even knowing the danger, even watching good men die, I cannot release you." "Then stop trying to," Mira said, covering his hand with hers. "Stop trying to make this decision for me. I'm not some damsel who needs rescuing from her own choices. I knew what I was getting into when I kept meeting with you. Maybe I didn't understand the full scope then, but I do now, and I'm still here." You're here because I ripped a door off its hinges and carried you out like a brute, Vladislav pointed out. But there was a ghost of dark humor in his voice. I'm here because some part of me wanted you to find me, Mira admitted. I'm here because running felt wrong. I'm here because, even with everything that's happened, I'm not ready to give up on this, on us, whatever us means. Vladislav was silent for a long moment, his crimson eyes searching her face as if trying to determine if she truly meant what she was saying. Finally, he leaned forward and pressed his forehead to hers, a gesture of intimacy that somehow felt more profound than a kiss. Then we stop hiding, he said quietly. We stop pretending that this is something that will simply fade with time, and we face the Northern Court together as a united front. If Elisabetta wants war, she shall have it, but she will learn that you are under my protection absolutely, and that any who threaten you will face the full might of the Eastern Territories. That's quite a declaration, Mira murmured. You deserve nothing less. He pulled back slightly, his expression becoming more businesslike even as his hand remained gentle against her face. But first you need to understand what you are committing to. Come, there are things I must show you. They exited the car, and Vladislav led her not toward the elevator that would take them up to the mansion's main floors, but toward a doorway set into the far wall of the garage. It was unmarked, heavy steel, and when Vladislav pressed his palm against the security panel, Mira heard multiple locks disengaging with mechanical precision. Those what? This is the heart of the Eastern Territories, he explained, as the door swung open to reveal a descending staircase carved from stone. What you have seen until now, the mansion, the public courts, the meetings with other vampires, all of that is theater. Performance for those who need to see power displayed. But this is where the real work happens. The stairs spiraled down for what felt like stories, lit by fixtures designed to look like old gas lamps, but clearly running on electricity. The air grew colder as they descended, and Mira found herself grateful for Vladislav's steadying hand at the small of her back. Finally, they emerged into a vast underground complex that made her stop and stare in wonder. It looked like a palace carved from the bedrock itself, soaring ceilings supported by columns of stone and steel, walls lined with what appeared to be centuries of accumulated artwork and artifacts, floors polished to a mirror sheen. There were vampires everywhere, dozens of them, all with that same pale skin and regal bearing, all moving with purpose through the corridors. Some glanced at Vladislav and bowed slightly. Others ignored them entirely, absorbed in conversations or examining documents or hurrying toward whatever business required their attention. Welcome to the Undercourt, Vladislav said. The true seat of vampire government in the Eastern Territories. Every major city has one hidden complexes where we conduct the business of immortal rule away from human eyes. This particular court has existed for over 300 years, constantly expanding, constantly evolving. He guided her through the corridors, and Mira tried to absorb everything at once. They passed what looked like a war room, where vampires in military attire studied maps and tactical displays. A library that could rival any university collection, filled with books and scrolls that looked ancient beyond measure. Training halls where vampires sparred with inhuman speed and grace. Conference rooms where heated discussions were taking place in languages Mira couldn't identify. There are approximately 400 vampires under my direct rule, Vladislav explained as they walked. Another 2,000 throughout the Eastern Territories who pledge allegiance to this court. We are not the largest of the vampire nations, but we are perhaps the most stable. The Northern Court, by contrast, has nearly double our numbers, but constant internal strife. Elisabetta Corvinus holds her throne through fear and brutality, and there are many who would see her deposed if they thought they could survive the attempt. So this war, Mira said slowly, it's not really about me at all, is it? I'm just an excuse, a justification for something that was already going to happen. Perceptive, Vladislav said approvingly. Yes? Elisabetta has been looking for an opportunity to expand her territory for decades. She sees the Eastern Territories as rightfully hers. We share a border, and there has been tension along it for years. Your appearance in my life simply gave her the excuse she needed to claim moral justification. The Eastern King has been compromised by human attachment, she will tell her people. He has become weak, unsuitable to hold his crown. We invade not for conquest, but for the good of all vampire kind. They had reached a pair of massive doors carved with intricate designs that Mira recognized from her research, the same symbols that had been on the ancient treaty. Vladislav pushed them open to reveal a throne room that took her breath away. It was elegant in its severity, black stone and dark wood, no gold or jewels or ostentatious displays of wealth. Just power, pure and undiluted, emanating from the raised dais at the far end, where a throne carved from a single piece of obsidian sat empty. "I hate that chair," Vladislav said conversationally as he led her toward it. "It is uncomfortable, it is impractical, and it represents everything I dislike about vampire culture: the posturing, the performance, the constant need to prove dominance through symbols rather than action. But tradition demands it, so I sit in it when I must and count the moments until I can leave." He ascended the dais but didn't sit. Instead, he turned to face the empty throne room, and Mira moved to stand beside him. From this vantage point, she could see how the room was designed, every angle calculated to make whoever sat on the throne seem more imposing, more powerful. It was theatrical, exactly as Vladislav had described. "If we do this, if we truly commit to this relationship, it will change both of our lives irrevocably," Vladislav said, his voice echoing slightly in the vast space. "You will be recognized as my consort, which comes with both privileges and dangers. The vampires of my court will have to accept you, and believe me when I say that will not be easy. Many of them already resent your influence over me. Making it official will create divisions." "And the alternative is I stay hidden forever?" Mira asked. "I remain your secret and we keep pretending this is casual?" "The alternative is I do what is logical and turn you," Vladislav said bluntly. "Make you vampire, give you immortality and strength and power, remove the vulnerability of your human fragility." Mira's heart skipped. Is that what you want?" "What I want is irrelevant," he said, but there was tension in his voice that suggested otherwise. "The question is what you want. Because I will not force this choice on you. Mira, I will not take your humanity without your full consent, given freely and with complete understanding of what you would be gaining and losing." "What would I be losing?" Mira asked quietly. "Sunlight," Vladislav said immediately. "The ability to walk in daylight without pain. Your mortality, which means watching everyone you know who remains human age and die while you remain unchanged. Your humanity itself, the warmth of your blood, the beat of your heart, the simple physical experiences of eating and sleeping and feeling the passage of time the way humans do. You would become something else, something other. And there is no going back." He turned to look at her, and the expression on his face was more vulnerable than she'd ever seen it. "But you would also gain centuries of life, strength that would make you nearly impossible to kill, the ability to heal from injuries that would be fatal to humans. And you would be my equal, Mira. Not a human under my protection, but a vampire of the Eastern Court, with all the rights and respect that entails. You could rule beside me, truly, not as some hidden mistress, but as a partner." Mira felt the weight of the decision settling over her like a physical thing. This was it, the moment that would define everything that came after. And she had no idea what the right answer was. "I need time," she said finally. "I need to think about this, really think about it when I'm not running on adrenaline and fear. Can you give me that?" "I can give you time," Vladislav agreed, "but not much. Elizabeta will not wait for us to resolve our personal drama. Intelligence suggests she is mobilizing forces along the border. We have perhaps 2 weeks before the invasion begins in earnest, and when it does, you will be a primary target. If you are going to make this choice, it must be soon." 2 weeks, Mira repeated, "to decide whether I want to become an immortal vampire and completely transform my entire existence. No pressure." Despite everything, Vladislav laughed, a short, surprised sound that transformed his severe features into something almost boyish. "When you phrase it that way, it does seem rather dramatic." "Just slightly," Mira agreed, and found herself laughing too, the absurdity of the situation briefly overwhelming the gravity of it. Here she was, standing in an underground vampire throne room, discussing immortality with a 500-year-old king who had ripped a steel door off its hinges to rescue her from her own poor decisions. It was insane. It was impossible. It was her life now. The laughter faded, and they stood in comfortable silence for a moment. Then Vladislav held out his hand. "Come, you should rest. It has been a long and traumatic day, and you are still running on the adrenaline from yesterday's attack." I have rooms prepared for you, comfortable, secure, and in a section of the undercourt where the sunlight cannot reach, even if you wanted to make another escape attempt." "Are you saying I'm a prisoner?" Mira asked, raising an eyebrow. "I am saying you are under protection," Vladislav corrected, "but I'm not naive enough to pretend you cannot leave if you are truly determined. You managed it once already, despite precautions. I will simply have to convince you that staying is the better option." He led her through more corridors, these ones more residential in nature. They passed doors that presumably led to living quarters, common rooms where vampires were gathered in conversation, what looked like a formal dining room, though Mira had no idea what vampires would dine on in there. Finally, Vladislav stopped at a door near the end of a quiet hallway and pressed his palm to the lock. "These are your rooms," he said as the door opened, "connected to mine by that door there." He indicated a door on the far wall, "But your space is entirely your own. I will not enter without permission." The rooms were beautiful, not ostentatious, but comfortable. A large bedroom with a massive bed piled with pillows and blankets, a sitting area with plush furniture and bookshelves, a bathroom that looked like something from a luxury hotel. There were clothes in the closet, Mira noticed, in her size. When had he arranged that? "How long have you been planning to bring me here?" she asked. "Since the second assassination attempt," Vladislav admitted. "I had hoped to convince you to come willingly, but I was prepared to do whatever was necessary to ensure your safety, including apparently ripping doors from hinges. You're never going to let me forget that, are you? Would you prefer I had knocked politely?" He moved closer until they were standing just inches apart, and Mira could feel the chill that radiated from him like a personal winter. "You locked yourself away, Mira. You tried to hide from me, from your feelings, from the reality of what we are to each other. Sometimes subtlety is not the appropriate response. And brute force is? When the woman I love is in danger?" Vladislav said softly. "Yes, always." Mira's breath caught. It was the first time either of them had used that word love. They'd danced around it, implied it, but never stated it so baldly. And hearing it now, in Vladislav's careful, accented voice, made something in her chest tighten and soar simultaneously. "You love me," she whispered. "I love you," he confirmed, desperately, dangerously, against all logic and wisdom. "I love you enough to go to war for you, enough to risk everything I have built over centuries, enough to terrify myself with how vulnerable you make me. And I needed you to know that before you make your decision about your future. Whatever you choose, that truth remains." Mira reached up and cupped his face with both hands, feeling the marble coldness of his skin against her palms. "I love you too," she said. "I think I have since that first night when you looked at my research and saw my passion instead of just my work. I love you, Vladislav Draculesht, and I don't know what that means for my future or what choice I'm going to make. But I know I'm not running again." He kissed her then finally, after 3 months of tension and longing and careful distance. His lips were cold against hers, but the kiss itself was anything but. It was possession and promise, desperation and devotion, all tangled together in a moment that seemed to stretch and compress time simultaneously. Mira's fingers threaded into his white hair, pulling him closer, and she felt his arms wrap around her waist with a strength that could crush her, but remained perfectly controlled. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, though she suspected Vladislav's breathlessness was more psychological than physiological, he rested his forehead against hers again. "Stay with me tonight," he said quietly. "Not for anything physical, just stay. Let me hold you while you sleep. Let me know you are safe." "Yes," Mira agreed without hesitation. "Yes to all of that." They moved to the bed, and Mira discovered that despite his coldness, despite his immortal nature, Vladislav made a surprisingly comfortable pillow. She curled against his side, his arm around her shoulders, and felt safer than she had in weeks. "Tell me about the treaty," she said sleepily. "The one I found. What really happened to the peace it promised?" Vladislav was quiet for a moment, his fingers tracing absent patterns on her shoulder. "The treaty was meant to prevent exactly what is happening now, territorial wars between the vampire nations. 7 kings signed it in blood, swearing to respect the borders we had established, to settle disputes through negotiation rather than violence. For 300 years, it held. And then, slowly, the kings who had signed it began to die, not from violence, but from time. Even vampires are not truly immortal. We can live for millennia, but eventually, the weight of years becomes too much. The mind fractures, the body begins to fail in small ways, and we fade. But you're still here, Mira said. "Ka, I am still here," he agreed. The youngest of the 7 who signed, and the only one remaining. The others either faded naturally or were killed in challenges to their thrones. And with each death, the treaty became less meaningful to their successors. New kings and queens rose who had not made those vows, who saw the old borders as inconvenient rather than sacred. Elisabetta is one of them. She took the northern throne only 80 years ago, after orchestrating the death of the previous ruler. She never knew the world before the treaty, and she has no respect for what it represented. "So you're the last link to that peace," Mira said. "I am the last link to a world that no longer exists," Vladislav corrected. "Which is why your discovery of the treaty was so significant. It proved that the peace had been real, that the borders we hold now were established by law and blood, not merely claimed through force. It gave legitimacy to my position in the Eastern Territories. And that is what Elisabetta cannot tolerate, proof that her claims to my lands are baseless. So she tried to kill me to destroy that proof." "She tried to kill you because you matter to me," Vladislav said bluntly. "The treaty was simply the excuse. Make no mistake, Mira, this war is personal. Elisabetta sees my attachment to you as weakness, and she intends to exploit it. By making you suffer, she believes she can break me, destabilize my rule, make my people question my leadership, create the chaos she needs to justify invasion." "Will it work?" Mira asked. "If something happens to me, will you break?" Vladislav's arms tightened around her almost imperceptibly. "I do not know," he admitted, "and that terrifies me more than any army Elisabetta can field." They lapsed into silence after that, and Mira felt exhaustion finally catching up with her. The adrenaline that had sustained her through the escape and recapture was fading, leaving her drained and bone-tired. Her eyes drifted closed, and the last thing she was aware of was Vladislav's cool lips pressing against her forehead, and his voice, soft and serious, making what sounded like a vow in a language she didn't understand. When Mira woke, she was alone in the bed, but there was a note on the pillow beside her in elegant handwriting. "Council meeting. Stay in the rooms until I return. Dorian is outside the door if you need anything." She checked her phone. Somehow it was already evening, which meant she'd slept through the entire day. That made sense, as she supposed, given that she'd barely slept the previous night while hiding in the storage room. The vampire schedule was going to take some getting used to if she stayed in this world. When she stayed, she corrected herself. Not if. She'd already made that decision when she'd told Vladislav she wasn't running again. Mira showered, using the expensive products stocked in the bathroom, and found that the clothes in the closet fit her perfectly. Someone had clearly done their homework on her sizes. She dressed in jeans and a soft sweater, casual comfort rather than anything formal, and was debating whether to take Vladislav up on his suggestion to stay in the rooms when she heard voices from the corridor outside. They were arguing, she realized as she moved closer to the door. Multiple vampires, their voices pitched low but intense, and one of them sounded furious. Absolute insanity to allow her into the undercourt. She is a human, Dorian. A liability and a weakness, no matter what the king believes. The king's personal affairs are not yours to question, Lucian. That was Dorian's voice, calm but firm. Lady Kensington is under his direct protection. Lady Kensington, the first vampire, Lucian said with dripping contempt, we are giving titles to humans now? What's next? Shall we invite them to sit in council? Perhaps we should just throw open the doors and invite the entire mortal world to witness our secrets. Your objection is noted, Dorian said. I will ensure it is passed along to the king. My objection should be shared by every vampire in this court, Lucian snapped. We are at war because of this human's existence. Good vampires are going to die defending the king's pet mortal, and for what? So Vladislav can pretend he is still capable of human emotion. He is a vampire, Dorian. 5 centuries old. One of the most powerful kings in existence, and he is throwing it all away for a creature who will be dead in the blink of an eye by our standards. Mira felt something hot and angry rising in her chest. She shouldn't open the door, she knew that logically. Getting into an argument with a hostile vampire was probably high on the list of bad ideas. But she'd spent 3 months being talked about like she was a problem to be solved rather than a person, and she was done being passive about it. She yanked open the door, and 3 vampires standing in the corridor turned to stare at her in surprise. Dorian, whom she recognized, looked alarmed. The other two, presumably Lucian and an associate, looked shocked that she'd overheard. "I'm going to say this once," Mira said, proud that her voice remained steady despite her racing heart. "I know you don't want me here. I know you think I'm a weakness and a liability, and honestly, you're right. I am human. I am mortal, and I'm absolutely a vulnerability that your enemies will try to exploit. But I'm also not going anywhere, so you can either accept that or take it up with your king." Lucian, a vampire with the same pale skin and white hair as all his kind but with a particularly sharp predatory face, took a step toward her. "And what makes you think you have any authority to—" "Lucian," Dorian's voice cracked like a whip. "Stand down." "She is not one of us," Lucian said, but he'd stopped advancing. "She has no right to speak to me with such—" "She is the king's beloved," Dorian interrupted, "which means she has every right. And unless you wish to explain to Vladislav why you were threatening her outside her own rooms, I suggest you remember your place." Lucian's crimson eyes flashed with anger, but he inclined his head in a gesture that was probably meant to be respectful, but came across as mocking. "Of course. My apologies, Lady Kensington." The way he said her name made it sound like an insult. "I forgot myself." He brushed past her into the corridor beyond, his companion following, and Mira released a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. "That was either very brave or very foolish," Dorian said once they were gone. "Possibly both." "I'm getting that a lot lately," Mira muttered. "Is he right? Are there a lot of vampires in the court who feel that way?" Dorian hesitated, which was answer enough. "There are some who question the king's judgment in this matter," he admitted carefully. "But they are a minority, and they will fall in line once the king makes his position clear. Vampires respect power above all else, and Vladislav is powerful. Those who oppose him will do so quietly, if at all." "That's not exactly reassuring." "No," Dorian agreed, "but it is honest, which I suspect you prefer to comfortable lies." "You're right about that," Mira said. She studied the vampire, who looked younger than Vladislav, maybe 30s in human terms, but moved with the same predatory grace. "How long have you served him?" "Nearly 150 years, Dorian said. "I was turned during the American Civil War, and I pledged myself to the Eastern Territories shortly after. Vladislav gave me purpose when I had none, structure when I was lost. I owe him everything." "So you support his decision about me? About us?" Dorian met her gaze directly. "I support whatever makes my king happy," he said simply. "I have served Vladislav for over a century, and I have never seen him allow himself to care for anything the way he cares for you. If you make him happy, then yes, I support it, even knowing the complications it creates." "Thank you," Mira said quietly, "for being honest, and for knocking that coffee cup out of my hand last week." "Simply doing my duty," Dorian said, but there was a hint of warmth in his voice. "The king is still in council, but he asked me to bring you to the archives when you woke. He thought you might be interested in seeing the full historical collection, including the original documents related to the treaty." Mira felt her curiosity spike immediately. "Yes, absolutely yes." The archives turned out to be even more impressive than the library she'd seen briefly the day before. They were housed in a separate wing of the undercourt, behind multiple layers of security that Dorian navigated with practiced ease. The space itself was climate-controlled and organized with the kind of meticulous care that made Mira's historian heart sing. Row after row of shelves holding documents, artifacts, books, centuries of vampire history preserved for posterity. "This is incredible," she breathed, turning in a slow circle to take it all in. "How much of this has been digitized?" "Approximately 40%, Dorian said. "It is an ongoing project. Vladislav brought in specialists about 20 years ago to begin the process, but there is so much material that it will likely take several more decades to complete." "I could help with that," Mira said without thinking. "I have experience with historical preservation and digitization. I could—" She cut herself off, realizing what she was saying. Offering to help with a decades-long project implied she would be here for decades, which meant making a certain choice about her future. "The king would likely welcome your expertise," Dorian said diplomatically. "The treaty documents are in this section. I will leave you to examine them at your leisure. If you need anything, there's a call button by the desk." He left her alone in the archives, and Mira immediately moved to the section he'd indicated. The treaty she'd originally discovered at the museum was there, preserved now in a protective case, But there were other documents as well, correspondence between the seven kings, draft versions of the treaty with annotations in multiple hands, even what appeared to be personal journals from some of the signatories. She lost herself in the research, the way she always did when presented with historical documents. Time ceased to have meaning as she carefully examined each piece, taking notes on her phone, cross-referencing dates and details. The treaty itself was even more significant than she had realized. It hadn't just established borders, but had created a framework for vampire governance that was remarkably sophisticated. Trade agreements, diplomatic protocols, procedures for handling disputes, all of it laid out in careful legal language that would have been impressive in any era. And throughout the documents, one voice appeared more frequently than others: Vladislav's. His handwriting was distinctive, elegant, and precise, and his contributions to the negotiations had clearly been substantial. He'd been the one to suggest the blood signing that made the treaty binding. He'd written much of the diplomatic protocol. He'd argued passionately, according to the journal entries, for peace as a strength rather than a weakness. Mira was reading one of his letters to another king, an eloquent argument for why territorial expansion was unsustainable in the modern world, when she felt a presence behind her. She turned to find Vladislav leaning against one of the shelves, watching her with an expression that was equal parts fond and amused. "How long have you been standing there?" she asked. "Long enough to confirm that you are exactly as beautiful when absorbed in research as I remembered," he said, pushing off the shelf and moving to join her at the desk. "Dorian said you had been here for 3 hours. I wanted to check that you were still among the living and had not gotten lost in the documents entirely." 3 hours? Mira checked her phone and was startled to see he was right. "I didn't realize I was reading your letters, the ones you wrote during the treaty negotiations. Vladislav, these are incredible. The arguments you were making about sustainable governance, about power through cooperation rather than domination, they were ahead of their time, even by modern standards." "I have had a great deal of time to think about politics," Vladislav said dryly. "One develops certain philosophies after watching empires rise and fall for centuries." He looked down at the documents spread across the desk. "I had forgotten much of this existed. It has been decades since I reviewed these papers." "Why?" Mira asked. "If this was such an important achievement, why lock it away?" "Because it failed," Vladislav said simply. "Oh, it succeeded for 3 centuries, which is longer than most human nations have existed. But ultimately, it failed. The peace I worked so hard to establish is crumbling, and I am powerless to stop it. Looking at these documents simply reminds me of that failure." "You're not powerless," Mira said firmly. "You're one king, yes, but you have resources and allies, and I am outnumbered," Vladislav interrupted. "Elisabetta has twice our forces, and she has been building alliances with other courts. The Western territories are officially neutral. But I know their queen has been in secret negotiations with the North. The Southern court is too fractured to offer meaningful support even if they wanted to. I have perhaps 150 years of political capital I can spend, but against the forces arraying against us, that may not be enough." "Then we need to change the game," Mira said. "Stop fighting on her terms. Find a way to undermine her support, to make the other courts question whether siding with her is in their best interests." Vladislav raised an eyebrow. "You have strategic suggestions?" "I have research suggestions," Mira corrected. "Elisabetta took her throne through violence 80 years ago, right? Which means there are probably vampires in the Northern Court who remember the previous ruler, who might have loyalties that predate her reign. And if she's building alliances through secret negotiations, that suggests she doesn't have complete confidence in her own position. People who are secure in their power don't sneak around." "People who are strategic sneak around," Vladislav countered, but there was interest in his eyes now. "But your point has merit. If we could find vampires in the Northern Court who might be convinced to oppose her, who might see her invasion as unjustified, you could create internal pressure that forces her to reconsider," Mira finished, "or at least delays her long enough for you to strengthen your own position." Vladislav was quiet for a moment, studying her. Then he smiled a real smile, not the careful expression he usually wore, but something genuine and warm. "This is why I love you," he said. "You see problems differently than vampires do. We think in terms of power and force, because that is what we understand. You think in terms of systems and incentives, finding the pressure points that can shift outcomes without direct violence. It is refreshing." "I'm a historian," Mira said. "I study how societies work and why they fail. Vampire society isn't that different from human society, at least in terms of power dynamics. It is more different than you know, Vladislav said, but not unkindly. We are not human, Mira, no matter how well we may imitate humanity. Our motivations, our values, our very thought processes are shaped by immortality in ways that are difficult to explain. But you are right that there are patterns power accumulates, alliances shift, the ambitious seek to challenge the established order. Those truths are universal. He held out his hand. Come. I want to show you something. Mira let him lead her out of the archives and through more corridors, deeper into the undercourt. They were heading down, she realized, descending yet another set of stairs into levels that felt older, more primitive. The walls here were rougher, less finished, and the air had a different quality, not stale exactly, but ancient. These are the original tunnels, Vladislav explained, the foundation upon which everything else was built. They date back to the founding of this city, when it was nothing but a settlement on the river. Vampires have always preferred to build down rather than up. Sunlight reaches the surface, but in the deep places, we are safe. They emerged into a chamber that was clearly natural rather than constructed, a cave, basically, with stalactites hanging from the ceiling and a pool of dark water at the center. But someone had added human touches over the centuries, lanterns that cast warm light, furniture carved from stone, tapestries hanging on the rougher walls. This is where I come when I need to remember who I am, Vladislav said quietly. What I am. This was here before the undercourt, before the mansion above, before any of the structures we use to pretend we are civilized. This is the truth beneath everything. Vampires are creatures of darkness and stone and blood. We build our palaces and wear our fine clothes and hold our elegant councils, but underneath, we are still monsters who dwell in caves. Mira moved to the edge of the pool, looking into water so dark it reflected nothing. Why are you showing me this? Because if you choose to become one of us, this is what you will be choosing, Vladislav said. Not the glamour or the power or the immortality, those are just trappings. You will be choosing to become a creature of the deep places, Mira, to leave behind sunlight and warmth and everything that makes you human. And I need you to understand that before you make your decision. Mira turned to face him, seeing him properly for perhaps the first time. Not the elegant vampire king, not the sophisticated scholar who discussed history with her in comfortable rooms, but the ancient predator who had survived 500 years through strength and cunning and absolute ruthlessness. He looked dangerous here, in this primitive space, his white hair and pale skin almost glowing in the lantern light, his crimson eyes reflecting like a cat's. You're trying to scare me, she said. I am trying to be honest with you, Vladislav corrected. I love you too much to let you make this choice based on romance and passion alone. If you become vampire, there is no going back. Your humanity will be lost forever, and you will have to live with that choice for centuries. I need you to be certain. And if I choose to stay human, Mira asked, what then? Then we find a way to make it work, Vladislav said simply. We defeat Elisabetta's invasion, we establish protections for you that even the Northern Court cannot breach, and we accept that our time together will be measured in decades rather than centuries. When you age and die, I will grieve you, but I will have had the privilege of loving you, which is more than I ever expected to experience again. Mira felt tears pricking at her eyes. That's a lot of pressure to put on one decision. I know, Vladislav said, and he sounded genuinely sorry. But there is no way to make this choice easier. Either path will change your life irrevocably. All I can do is promise that whichever path you choose, I will walk it with you for as long as I am able. They stood in silence for a long moment, the weight of the decision hanging between them. Then Mira crossed the space between them and wrapped her arms around Vladislav's waist, pressing her face against his chest. He held her carefully, as if afraid she might break, and she felt his lips brush against the top of her head. I'm not ready to decide yet, she whispered. Is that okay? It is more than okay, Vladislav assured her. Take the time you need. We have a week, perhaps 2, before circumstances will force the issue. Until then, simply be here with me. Let me show you both the beauty and the darkness of this world, and then make your choice with full knowledge. Over the following days, Vladislav was true to his word. He showed Mira everything: the elegant councils where vampire law was debated and decided, the training grounds where warriors prepared for the coming conflict, the residential sections where vampires lived lives that looked almost normal. She met more of the court, some who were welcoming and others who made their disapproval clear through cold politeness. She learned about vampire culture, their customs and hierarchies, their art and literature, and the complex social structures that governed immortal society. But he also showed her the darker aspects. The blood banks where they kept human donors willing volunteers, he assured her, who were paid well and treated carefully, but still fundamentally livestock. The cells where vampires who broke their laws were imprisoned, some of them having been there for decades. The memorials to vampires who had died in past conflicts, their names carved into black stone in a hall that stretched seemingly forever. "We do not forget our dead," Vladislav explained as they walked through the memorial hall. "Even though we are immortal, we understand loss. Every name here represents a vampire who walked this earth for decades or centuries, who had relationships and accomplishments and dreams, and who was still destroyed. It is a reminder that immortality is not invulnerability." Mira stopped at one name carved more deeply than others. Constantine Draculesht, 1401–1789. "Your brother?" she guessed. "My younger brother," Vladislav confirmed. "He was turned a decade after I was, and we ruled the Eastern Territories together for nearly 4 centuries. He died in a challenge from a vampire who thought he could take our throne through violence. He was wrong, I killed him, and everyone who supported him but Constantine was still gone. There is a particular pain in losing someone you have known for so long, Mira. It becomes harder to remember what the world was like before they existed, and harder still to imagine continuing without them." "I'm sorry," Mira said quietly. "It was over 2 centuries ago," Vladislav said. "The grief has faded to a dull ache, but I remember, which is all any of us can do for those we have lost." They continued through the hall in silence, and Mira found herself thinking about what it would mean to live for centuries, to watch the world change around you, to lose people you cared about over and over, to carry the weight of so much memory and experience. It seemed beautiful and terrible in equal measure. On the 5th day after Vladislav had carried her from the storage room, Mira was in the archives again when Dorian appeared with urgent news. "Border Patrol reports movement in the Northern Territories," he said without preamble. "Elisabetta's forces are mobilizing earlier than expected. The king is convening an emergency war council and requests your presence." "My presence?" Mira said, startled. "I'm not part of your military command." "No, but you are part of the reason for this conflict," Dorian said bluntly. "And the king values your perspective. Come." The war council was already in session when they arrived, held in the room Mira had glimpsed days before vampires in military attire, gathered around tactical displays, showing maps and force positions. Vladislav stood at the head of the table, and when Mira entered, he gestured for her to join him. "Intelligence indicates that northern forces will reach our border within 3 days, he was saying as Mira took position beside him. Numbers suggest approximately 800 vampires in the initial assault force, with reserves held back for a second wave if needed. They will target our border settlements first, attempting to establish forward positions before pushing toward the undercourt." "Our forces?" one of the military vampires asked. "Vas 450 in defensive positions," another vampire woman with strategic insignia replied. "We can call in another 100 from outlying territories, but they will take time to arrive. We are outnumbered nearly 2 to 1. "Standard defensive tactics suggest we fall back to more defensible positions," someone else said. "Force them to overextend their supply lines, wage a campaign of attrition rather than direct confrontation." "Which would work if they were human," Vladislav said. "But vampires do not require supply lines in the traditional sense. We can survive on minimal blood for weeks, and we can move far faster than human armies. A war of attrition favors the larger force." "Then we need to change the battlefield," Mira said, and everyone turned to look at her. She felt her face heat under the scrutiny of so many ancient predators, but forced herself to continue. "You said Elisabetta is mobilizing earlier than expected. That suggests something has changed. Either she's overconfident, or she's been forced to accelerate her timeline. If we can figure out why, we might be able to exploit that weakness." "Intelligence suggests internal pressure," the strategic vampire said. "There are factions in the Northern Court who question her aggressive expansion. She may be moving now because she fears losing support if she delays." "Then we give those factions a reason to act," Mira said. "We send envoys to the Northern Court offering alternative proposals. Peace negotiations, territorial agreements, anything that makes her look unreasonable for refusing. We're not trying to actually negotiate, we're trying to create dissent among her supporters. It would never work, someone objected. Elisabetta would simply kill any envoys we sent. Not if we make it public, Mira countered. Send the offers through channels that other vampire courts will hear about. Make it clear that we're seeking diplomatic solutions while she's choosing violence. You said the Western territories are neutral, but wavering give them a reason to support you instead of her. Show them that you're the reasonable party here. The room erupted into discussion, vampires arguing for and against the proposal. Vladislav listened quietly, his expression thoughtful, until he finally raised a hand for silence. "Ius, we will pursue both approaches," he decided. "Prepare our defensive forces as planned, but also draft diplomatic overtures to be sent to the Northern Court through public channels. Mira is correct that we need to undermine Elisabetta's political position as well as her military one. If we can force her to defend her actions to other courts, it may slow her advance or fracture her support." Orders were given, strategies refined, and the council dispersed to carry out their assigned tasks. When the room had cleared, Vladislav turned to Mira with an expression of mixed pride and concern. That was well done," he said. "You have a tactical mind, but you have also made yourself even more of a target. By participating in war councils, by offering strategies, you have demonstrated that you are not simply my personal weakness, but an active threat to Northern interests." "Good," Mira said firmly. "I'm tired of being passive in all this. If I'm going to be targeted anyway, I might as well be useful." "Your courage is admirable," Vladislav said softly, "and terrifying. Do you have any idea how difficult it is for me to watch you put yourself in danger?" "Probably about as difficult as it is for me to watch you prepare for war," Mira replied. She reached up and cupped his face, feeling the familiar cold of his skin. "We're in this together, remember? For better or worse." "Together," Vladislav agreed. Then, after a moment's hesitation, "Mira, I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly." "Always," she promised. "If circumstances forced you to make your decision today, if the choice was between becoming vampire immediately or losing any chance at immortality, what would you choose?" Mira felt her heart skip. "Why are you asking?" "Because there is a possibility you will be captured or killed when Elisabetta's forces attack," Vladislav said bluntly. "And if that happens, if you are dying and there is no other way to save you, I need to know if you would want me to turn you without your conscious consent. I need to know if saving your life that way would be a gift or a betrayal." Mira stared at him, the weight of the question settling over her. It was the ultimate choice, compressed into a single moment: live forever as a vampire or die as a human. And she realized, standing there in the empty war room with Vladislav looking at her with desperate hope and fear, that she already knew her answer. "I would want you to turn me," she said quietly. "If it's a choice between dying and becoming vampire, I want to live. Even if that means living as something other than human." Relief flooded Vladislav's features so completely that Mira realized he'd been genuinely afraid of her answer. "You are certain?" "I'm certain that I'm not ready to leave you," Mira clarified. "I'm certain that I want more time, even if that time comes at the cost of my humanity." "Will I have regrets?" "Probably." "Will there be moments when I miss the sun and wish I'd made a different choice?" "Almost definitely. But losing you, losing us, that would be a bigger regret." Vladislav pulled her into his arms, holding her with a tightness that would have been painful if she were less willing. "Then you will live," he said fiercely. "Whatever comes, whatever happens in this war, I will ensure that you survive it, even if I must carry you from battlefields myself." "The door-ripping thing again?" Mira said, trying for levity. "If necessary," Vladislav said seriously. "I would tear down buildings, Mira. I would rip apart armies. I would challenge death itself to keep you safe." "That's very dramatic," Mira said. "I am a 500-year-old vampire king," Vladislav pointed out. "Drama is rather expected." They stood there for a long moment, holding each other in the empty room, and Mira felt a sense of peace settle over her despite the approaching war. She had made her choice, really. Now it was just a matter of surviving long enough to act on it. The diplomatic overtures were sent out the following day, formal offers of negotiation delivered through channels that ensured every major vampire court would be aware of them. As predicted, Elisabetta rejected them immediately with a message that was essentially a declaration of war she named Vladislav as unfit to rule, claimed the eastern territories by right of strength, and announced her intention to take the throne by force. But she also had to justify her rejection publicly, which meant spending political capital defending her aggressive stance. Intelligence reports suggested there was indeed dissent in the northern court, vampires questioning whether invasion was necessary when diplomatic options had been offered. It wasn't enough to stop the war, but it might slow it down or reduce the forces Elisabetta could commit with full confidence. Every advantage matters, Vladislav said when the reports came in. We are still outnumbered, but if her own people are questioning her, she will need to hold back troops to maintain control rather than committing everything to the invasion. It gives us a chance. The forces arrived at the border faster than expected, not 3 days, but 2. Midnight on the second night, sensors detected movement, and by the time defensive forces had mobilized, the first skirmishes were already underway. Vladislav left for the front lines immediately, despite Mira's protests, and she was left in the undercourt with only Dorian and a skeleton crew of guards for protection. He will return, Dorian said, though he sounded less certain than usual. The king is a formidable warrior. I have seen him fight. There are few who can match him. I hope you're right, Mira said, staring at the tactical displays that showed forces moving in real time. Red markers for northern troops, blue for eastern defenders, the two colors clashing along the border in a dance of violence that was being measured in vampire deaths. Hours passed with agonizing slowness. Reports came in sporadically. The northern forces were pushing hard but meeting stronger resistance than expected. Eastern defenders were falling back in good order, making the invaders pay for every mile. Vladislav himself was confirmed alive and fighting, his presence on the battlefield apparently inspiring his forces to heroic efforts. And then, at approximately 4 a.m, everything went wrong simultaneously. The alarms started blaring first breach alerts, indicating that something had gotten past the undercourt's external security. Then, Dorian was there, his face grim, pulling Mira to her feet. "We need to move now," he said urgently. Northern assassins, at least 6 of them, somehow made it into the residential levels. They're heading this way. "How is that possible?" Mira demanded, but she was already moving, letting Dorian rush her toward a back exit. "Traitor in the court," Dorian said grimly. "Had to be. They knew exactly how to bypass our security. The king has been notified, but he's too far away to return in time. I need to get you to a secure location until—" He didn't finish the sentence. Something moved faster than Mira's eyes could track, and Dorian was simply gone, thrown across the corridor with force that slammed him into the far wall hard enough to crack stone. And standing where he'd been a second before was a vampire woman with cold eyes and a smile that promised violence. "The human pet," she said in accented English. "Finally. Do you have any idea how tedious it has been trying to reach you? The Eastern King protects you so thoroughly. But everyone makes mistakes eventually, and tonight your protector is conveniently far from home." More vampires emerged from side corridors, 5 of them, all moving with predatory grace, all focused on Mira with lethal intent. Dorian was struggling to his feet, clearly injured, but still trying to position himself between Mira and the assassins. "You will not touch her," he said, his voice strained. "Really?" the lead assassin said. "And how do you plan to stop us? You are 1 vampire against 6. You are injured, and you have a fragile human to protect who will die from the slightest mistake." She moved closer to Mira, studying her like an interesting specimen. "I expected someone more impressive. The woman who brought the Eastern King to his knees is so ordinary." "Get away from her," Dorian warned, but the assassin ignored him. "I have my orders," she said, still focused on Mira. "Kill her swiftly, leave the body for the king to find, and evacuate before he returns seeking vengeance. Queen Elisabetta wants this done cleanly, no torture, no games. You should take comfort in that, human. Your death will be quick." She moved, inhuman fast, and Mira knew with absolute certainty that she was about to die. There was no time to run, no time to scream, no time for anything except the surreal acceptance that this was how it ended, killed by an ancient predator in an underground vampire court. Dying because she'd been foolish enough to love someone from a world she'd never been meant to touch. And then, the world exploded. The wall, the solid stone wall, simply disintegrated, torn apart from the outside with force that sent chunks of rock flying across the corridor. Through the dust and debris strode Vladislav, and he looked like something from a nightmare. His elegant clothes were shredded and stained with blood, His white hair was wild around his face, and his eyes burned with crimson fury that made even the assassins step back. "You dare," he said, his voice resonating with power that made the air itself vibrate. "You dare enter my home, threaten what is mine, and believe you will leave alive?" The lead assassin recovered first. "The king returns. How unexpected." But there was fear in her voice now, real fear. "We are 6 to your 1, Vladislav Draculesht. Even you cannot—" She never finished. Vladislav moved, and what followed was less a fight than an execution. He tore through the assassins with brutal efficiency, moving faster than Mira's human eyes could properly track. She saw flashes of vampires' heads separating from their body, another crushed against the wall hard enough to leave a crater, a third turned to ash so quickly it was as if they'd simply ceased to exist. The lead assassin tried to run. Vladislav caught her before she'd made it 3 steps, one hand closing around her throat. "You'll pay to you. You will return to Elizabeta Corvinus," he said with terrible calm. "You will tell her that she has made a fatal error. She targeted what I love, invaded my home, threatened what I have sworn to protect. There will be no negotiation now, no diplomatic resolution. There will be only war, and it will end with her dust scattered on ground that will never be hers. Do you understand?" The assassin managed a strangled nod. Vladislav threw her toward the shattered wall with force that sent her flying, and she fled into the darkness beyond. The other assassins were either dead or ash, and the corridor looked like a disaster zone. Then Vladislav turned to Mira, and his expression transformed from fury to desperate concern. "Are you hurt? Did they touch you?" "I'm fine," Mira said, though her voice shook. "Dorian kept them back until you arrived." Vladislav looked to where Dorian had collapsed against the wall, clearly in pain, but alive. "You have my gratitude and my debt. Rest healers are coming." Then he was moving to Mira, and despite the blood and the violence and the absolute destruction he'd just unleashed, she found herself stepping into his arms without hesitation. He lifted her as he had days before, cradling her against his chest, and carried her through the shattered wall and into the corridors beyond. "How did you know?" Mira asked as he walked. "How did you get here so fast?" "I felt it," Vladislav said simply. "You were in danger, and I felt it. I cannot explain it better than that some instinct, some connection that told me you needed me. I left the battlefield immediately, drove faster than should have been possible, and tore through every obstacle between us." "The door-ripping thing," Mira said, and felt slightly hysterical laughter bubble up. "You really do that a lot." "When the alternative is losing you, I will tear through anything." He carried her to his own chambers larger than hers, more austere, but comfortable in a masculine way. He set her down on the bed with surprising gentleness, then knelt beside her, his hands framing her face. "I nearly lost you tonight." "But you didn't," Mira said, covering his hands with hers. "You reached me in time." "This time," Vladislav said, and there was anguish in his voice. "But what about next time? What if I am not close enough, not fast enough? What if they succeed in taking you from me?" "Then you turn me," Mira said firmly. "Right now, tonight. We've been waiting for the perfect moment to make this decision, but there is no perfect moment. There's only now, and I'm choosing now." Vladislav stared at her. "Mira, you are in shock. This is not the time to—" "This is exactly the time," Mira interrupted. "I almost died tonight, Vladislav. And the only thing I could think as that assassin moved toward me was that I hadn't had enough time with you. I don't want to be the vulnerability anymore. I don't want to be the weakness that your enemies exploit. I want to be your partner, your equal, someone who can stand beside you in this war and every challenge that comes after. Turn me. Please." "You understand what you are asking?" Vladislav said, and his hands were shaking slightly where they touched her face. "You understand that this is permanent, irreversible?" "I understand," Mira said. "I'm asking anyway." Vladislav closed his eyes briefly, and when he opened them again, there was so much emotion there that Mira felt her breath catch. "I love you," he said, "more than I have loved anything in 5 centuries. If I do this, if I turn you, you need to know that it is not because you are a weakness or a burden. It is because I am selfish enough to want eternity with you, and because I believe you will be magnificent as one of us." "Then do it," Mira said. "Make me yours completely." The ritual was simpler than Mira had expected. Vladislav explained each step carefully first. He would drink from her, taking enough blood to bring her close to death. Then she would drink from him, his vampire blood replacing what he'd taken and beginning the transformation. The process would take approximately 3 days, during which she would be unconscious and her body would fundamentally change. When she woke, she would be vampire immortal, powerful, and forever changed. It will hurt, he warned her. The transformation is not gentle. Your entire body will be rewritten at the cellular level. But I will be here with you through all of it. I will not leave you alone in the darkness. I trust you, Mira said simply. Vladislav kissed her then deeply, desperately, a kiss that tasted like goodbye and hello simultaneously. Then he moved to her neck, and Mira felt his fangs pierce her skin with a brief, sharp pain that faded quickly into something that was almost pleasant. The world began to blur at the edges as blood loss took its toll, and she felt her consciousness starting to slip away. Then Vladislav's wrist was at her lips, blood welling from a cut he'd made, and his voice was in her ear. Drink, my love. Drink and be reborn. Mira drank. The blood was cold and strange, with a taste like metal and darkness, and something indefinably other. She felt it spreading through her system, felt something fundamental beginning to shift and change. The last thing she was aware of before unconsciousness claimed her completely was Vladislav's arms around her, and his voice whispering promises in languages she didn't understand. When Mira woke, the world was different. Not just different fundamentally, completely, overwhelmingly different. Every sense was amplified beyond anything she'd experienced as a human. She could hear conversations happening floors above her, could smell individual scents in the air with perfect clarity, could see in perfect detail despite the room being nearly dark. And the cold that had always radiated from Vladislav, she understood it now, because she felt it in herself. The absence of a heartbeat, the stillness of a body that no longer needed to breathe, the strange, half-alive state that was vampire existence. Welcome back, Vladislav's voice said, and she turned her head to find him sitting beside the bed. He looked exhausted in a way she'd never seen before, disheveled, strained, as if he'd been through his own personal trial. How do you feel? Strange, Mira said, and was startled by how her own voice sounded clearer somehow, more resonant. Everything is so intense. That will normalize, Vladislav assured her. For the first few weeks, sensory input will be overwhelming, but you will learn to filter it. You will learn to control your new strength, your new speed. You will learn to exist as vampire. Mira sat up slowly, and the movement was fluid in a way that felt foreign. She looked down at her hands, still her hands, but paler now, the veins less visible, the skin taking on that marble quality she'd seen in every vampire she'd met. I really am one of you now. You really are, Vladislav confirmed. He reached out and took one of her hands, lacing their fingers together. How do you feel about that? Mira considered the question seriously. There was loss. Yes, she would never see sunlight again, never feel warmth the way she had as human, never experience a dozen small pleasures she'd taken for granted. But there was also gain time stretching out before her like an endless road, power flowing through her veins, and most importantly, eternity with the man she loved. I feel like I made the right choice, she said finally. Ask me again in a century, and I might have a different answer, but right now, I feel like I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be. Vladislav's expression softened into something so tender it made her chest ache. I love you, he said simply. Thank you for choosing this, for choosing us. Always, Mira promised. The war was still raging, Mira learned as she recovered her strength over the following days. But something had changed. The political maneuvering they'd done before the invasion, combined with Vladislav's dramatic rescue and the failed assassination attempt, had created ripples throughout vampire society. The Western territories had formally declared support for the Eastern Court, providing reinforcements that evened the numerical odds. Several high-ranking vampires in the Northern Court had broken with Elisabetta publicly, questioning her leadership and refusing to participate in the invasion. Elisabetta herself was reportedly furious, her grip on power weakening as the costs of the war mounted with no clear victories to show for it. And the surviving assassin, who Vladislav had sent back with a message, had apparently delivered it faithfully. Elisabetta knew now that she'd made an enemy who would never stop, never negotiate, never show mercy. The war will end, Vladislav told Mira, as they stood in the war room, studying the latest tactical reports. Perhaps not immediately, but it will end. Elisabetta cannot sustain this campaign with her own court fractured and other territories supporting us. She will either retreat or be deposed by her own people. And then? Mira asked. And then we rebuild, Vladislav said. We strengthen the treaties, establish new protocols for preventing territorial conflicts, and hopefully create a lasting peace that will endure longer than I have. We have time now, Mira said, still getting used to the concept. Centuries to work on it. We do, Vladislav agreed. He turned to her, and in his eyes she saw the same love and devotion she'd seen when she'd been human. But now there was also partnership recognition of her as an equal, rather than something fragile to protect. What do you want to do with your eternity, Mira Kensington? Mira thought about the archives full of documents waiting to be preserved, the historical research that could span centuries rather than a single human lifetime, the opportunity to witness and record vampire history as it unfolded. She thought about the political work of building lasting peace, the challenge of reforming vampire society from within, the possibility of creating something better than what had existed before. I want to help you build something that lasts, she said finally. I want to be your partner in every sense, in ruling, in research, in creating a world where vampires and humans can coexist without constant fear. I want to use eternity for something meaningful. Then that is what we will do, Vladislav said. He pulled her close, and Mira realized that his temperature no longer felt cold to her. They matched now, two creatures of the same nature, two immortals choosing to face eternity together. The war ended 6 weeks later, not with a dramatic final battle but with a quiet coup in the northern court. Elisabetta was deposed by her own generals, who cited the disastrous invasion and her failure to maintain political alliances as justification. She was executed according to vampire law, her ashes scattered without ceremony, and a new ruler took the northern throne, one who immediately sued for peace and offered formal recognition of all existing territorial boundaries. Vladislav accepted the peace terms, but imposed conditions reparations for the lives lost in the invasion, guarantees of non-aggression, and most importantly, formal recognition of Mira's position as his consort and co-ruler of the Eastern Territories. The new northern ruler agreed to everything, clearly desperate to end a war that had nearly destroyed their court. The formal recognition ceremony was held in the throne room that Vladislav hated, with representatives from every major vampire court in attendance. Mira wore a gown of midnight blue that had been specially designed for the occasion, elegant and regal in a way she was still getting used to. Her white hair, the transformation, had changed its color. As it did for all vampires, was styled in an elaborate arrangement that had taken hours to perfect. You look beautiful, Vladislav murmured as they prepared to enter the throne room. He wore formal regalia that made him look every inch the ancient king. He was black and silver, with a circlet that was the closest thing he had to a crown. I look terrifying, Mira corrected. I'm still not used to the predator eyes thing. Every time I see my reflection, I'm startled. You will adjust, Vladislav promised. And for what it is worth, you wear immortality well. You are beautiful as a human, but as a vampire, you are magnificent. They entered the throne room together, and the assembled vampires, hundreds of them, representing courts from around the world, all turned to watch. Mira felt their assessment, their curiosity, their judgment. Some looked openly hostile, others merely skeptical. But many looked intrigued or even approving, particularly the younger vampires who seemed fascinated by the idea of a human scholar turned immortal queen. The ceremony itself was conducted in a mixture of languages, honoring vampire traditions that dated back centuries. Mira pledged herself to the Eastern Territories, accepted the responsibilities of rulership, and received the formal blessing of the assembled courts. When it was done, when she stood beside Vladislav's throne, wearing her own circlet of office, she felt the weight of it all settle over her, the expectations, the challenges, the sheer magnitude of what she had agreed to take on. But she also felt Vladislav's hand in hers, steady and sure, and knew she wasn't facing any of it alone. The reception after the ceremony lasted until dawn, vampires lingering to discuss politics and gossip and subtly assess the new power dynamics in vampire society. Mira found herself the center of attention, fielding questions about her transformation, her plans for her new role, her thoughts on vampire-human relations. She answered as diplomatically as she could, aware that every word was being analyzed for weakness or opportunity. Finally, as the first hints of sunrise approached and vampires began retreating to their quarters, Vladislav extracted them both from the crowd and led her back to their private chambers. You did well, he said as they collapsed onto the couch in the sitting room. You handled the politics better than many vampires who were born to it. I had a good teacher, Mira said, leaning against him, and I spent months watching you navigate vampire society. I learned from the best." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, the weight of the day finally lifting. Then Vladislav said quietly, "Do you regret it? Any of it?" Mira thought about everything that had happened, the fear and danger, the loss of her human life, the dramatic transformation that had changed her fundamental nature. She thought about the door ripped from its hinges, the assassins in the corridor, the choice made in a moment of crisis that had led to eternity. "No," she said finally. "I don't regret it. This isn't the life I expected or planned for. It's stranger and harder and more complicated than anything I could have imagined. But it's also more wonderful, more meaningful, more full of possibility. And I get to spend it with you, which makes everything worth it." "Even the politics?" Vladislav asked with a hint of amusement. "Even the politics," Mira confirmed, "though I reserve the right to complain extensively about boring council meetings." "That is only fair," Vladislav agreed. He pulled her closer, and Mira felt the contentment radiating from him, rare for someone as ancient and cautious as he was, but genuine. "I love you," he said softly. "My fierce, brilliant, impossible human who became my vampire queen. You have transformed my life as thoroughly as I transformed your nature." "I love you too," Mira said. "My dramatic, door-ripping, utterly devoted vampire king. Thank you for not giving up on us, even when I tried to run." "I would have followed you anywhere," Vladislav said simply. "Across cities or centuries, through any danger or obstacle. You are mine, Mira Draculesht, as I am yours. Nothing will change that now." "Draculesht," Mira repeated, trying out the surname she'd officially taken as part of the ceremony. "I'm still getting used to that." "You have centuries to adjust," Vladislav pointed out. "No rush." They stayed there as the sun rose above the ground far overhead, safe in their underground sanctuary, two immortals beginning an eternity together. Outside their chambers, the world continued vampire politics to navigate, rebuilding to oversee, the endless work of creating lasting peace. But in this moment, there was only the two of them, the love that had survived assassination attempts and war and transformation, the partnership that had been forged in crisis and tested by fire. Mira thought about the woman she'd been 3 months ago, the human historian, who had discovered a vampire treaty and accidentally stumbled into an immortal world. That woman was gone now, transformed as completely as her physical nature had been. But the core of who she was remained the curiosity, the determination, the willingness to fight for what mattered. And what mattered, she'd learned, was this: the connection between two people who should never have met but had found each other anyway, the love that could survive impossible odds, the choice to face eternity together rather than face it alone. "What are you thinking?" Vladislav asked, reading something in her expression. "I'm thinking that I would do it all again," Mira said honestly. "Every dangerous moment, every terrifying choice, every second of fear and uncertainty. I would do it all again for this ending." "This is not an ending," Vladislav corrected gently. "This is a beginning, the first page of a story that will span centuries." "Then I can't wait to see what happens next," Mira said. They sat together as day gave way to night once more, as the vampire world stirred to life around them, as their new reality settled into something that felt like home. There would be challenges ahead, Mira knew that, obstacles to overcome, enemies to face, difficult decisions to make. But they would face it all together, Vampire King and his chosen queen, partners in every sense that mattered. And somewhere deep in the archives, preserved in protective cases and carefully maintained for posterity, the ancient treaty remained proof that peace was possible, that different factions could find common ground, that even immortal conflicts could be resolved through wisdom rather than violence. It had failed once, that treaty, crumbled under the weight of changing times and changing rulers. But Mira had eternity now to build something better, to create new treaties, new alliances, new foundations for a world where vampires could thrive without constant war. It was ambitious, perhaps impossible, but she'd already done the impossible by surviving this long. What was one more impossible thing in a life that had become defined by them? "I love you," Vladislav said again, because apparently some things bore repeating even across eternity. "I love you too," Mira replied, because some truths were simple, no matter how complicated everything else became. And in the deep places beneath the city, In the underground court where vampires ruled from shadows, two immortals held each other and watched the darkness that was now their permanent home. It should have felt like lost sunlight traded for shadows, mortality traded for an endless night. But instead, it felt like freedom, like possibility, like the beginning of something magnificent. Outside, the human world continued its daylight existence, unaware of the dramas and transformations happening just below its feet. And in the vampire world, word spread of the Eastern King and his human-turned-vampire queen, the couple who had survived war and assassination and impossible odds to claim their eternity together. It became a story, as all great loves do whispered about in vampire courts, debated by scholars, romanticized by those who had never experienced anything similar. The tale of how a vampire king had ripped a door from its hinges to save the woman he loved, and how that woman had remained calm even in the face of certain death because she'd known he would come for her. But for Vladislav and Mira, it wasn't a story or a legend. It was simply their truth, messy and complicated and absolutely real. The love that had changed everything, the choice that had led to eternity, the partnership that would define centuries to come. And they were content with that, content to build their future one night at a time, one challenge at a time, one moment of joy and difficulty and triumph at a time. They had time now, endless, infinite time. Time to love, time to learn, time to create something lasting, time to prove that even in a world of darkness and danger, love could still find a way to not just survive, but thrive. Together, they faced the night. Together, they would face all the nights to come. And that, in the end, was all either of them needed.